Okay, well, let's go back to First Peter. Lost my track. First Peter chapter 2 is where we're going to be at here this evening. Am I on, guys? Have I got this turned on right? Okay. First Peter chapter 2. Anybody here get a nap this afternoon? Several? Okay. I was able to just lay down here this afternoon. We ended up staying here. We didn't go back to Houston. We just kind of stayed here. So I laid down just right back over there and slept for about 10 minutes. So thank you to whoever keeps their blankets in this place. I know. I don't know whose it was, but it smelled good. It had really nice perfume on it. Well, I got a little bit of a snooze, so that'll be a help here this evening. Okay, this morning, if you were here, we were dealing with the fact that Christ calls you, believer, at the moment you trusted Jesus Christ. He stamped you with a stamp that says washed, sanctified, justified. That He says you are set apart, not because of your skill set, not because of your abilities, not because of your looks or absence of them, but because you are mine. You are special. You are uniquely owned because you are mine. I hope I'm not out of turn by saying this, but a gentleman said to me on his way out this morning, he said, "For a long time I have felt as an inferior Christian, but this helped me realize I'm not." I resonated with that because I felt that myself too. You ever been around a Christian that they have it all together, it seems? I feel this often when I am with gifted pastors. Man, that guy can play the piano, the trumpet, the violin. He can sing specials. He can sing duets by himself. He's just he's an incredible father, an incredible husband. He's building his church, and I'm watching him feeling like, man, I'm a nobody. I can hardly play the radio, the classic statement. And yet to be reminded that my worth and my value and my preciousness comes back to, don't be offended by this, but it comes back to the fact that Christ's name has been tattooed irreplaceably across my heart. Nothing will change that. And that's why he says, you're set apart. You've got my name, and you're a special people. We ended this morning in 1 Peter chapter 2, and really what we were trying to deal with this morning is the position of being sanctified. Now, just like the gospel, the moment you are saved, you are supposed to experience the gospel the rest of your life, which is why the scripture says, work out your salvation. It's not saying that you're supposed to try to earn salvation as much as supposed to say your salvation that was worked in you is now supposed to be worked out of you. And so in the same way, sanctification, it is a position that I have been set apart, and now because of that, there is an anticipation and an expectation that because you are Christ's, you would live, and live different. I think of Ezekiel chapter 16, when the prophet is writing, like the words of Christ, when God sees Israel in their nativity. If you just listen to these words, God is speaking, coming by, describing Israel as being an infant child just born but abandoned. And it says, "And when I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thine own blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live." If you know that passage, he goes on to embellish how he took that little child, Israel, and bathed and clothed and put jewels on her and raised her. And it's that picture, that beautiful imagery of God coming to something that was polluted and common and saying, I'm going to rescue you so that you can live. Jesus said, I came to give life and life more abundantly. There is an anticipation, because I am Christ's and not my own, that I would live truly out of a place of rejoicing, but that I would live different. So what is some of the practical outworkings of my different living because I am different. Well, this is where we're going to park here for this evening's message. We're going to be looking at 4 key areas that ought to be different because I am different. So let's start reading in verse 6 of 1 Peter 2, and then we're going to get right into those verses that we read this morning, and then we're going to focus in on verses 9, 10, and 11. So starting in verse 6, Peter is calling the attention to Christ, our example. Wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Unto you, therefore, which believe, he is precious. But unto them which be disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. But ye, with the understanding that they're saved, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. I want us to see here this evening that because we are different, it is anticipated that we would live different in that we would praise, that's point number 1, in that we would refuse sin, in that we would live honest, in that we would attract the lost to become found. 4 areas, and these are not the only areas, but 4 key areas that this passage is revealing that because you are different, your difference ought to be worked out. Now, the thing I find precious about this passage, well, let me back up. It is a wrong approach. It's a common approach, but it is a wrong approach to use this passage as a stick for browbeating. But there have been many men who have resorted to that. In other words, it kind of looks like an angry coach at halftime and his football team is losing, and he comes into the locker room and he says, "What's the matter with you guys? My grandmother could run faster than you guys. I don't understand. If you all are, if you're going to continue playing this way, we're going to forfeit and I'm going to walk off the field." And did that really help anybody? He was trying to motivate them. He actually was trying to get them to dig deep, but what he did is he just used fear and intimidation, and all he did was discourage them. And too often, that has been an approach that has been taken in preaching. And I believe for some men, it's because they don't know how else to encourage people to stay on the straight and narrow, so the only thing they think to revert to is to fear and shame. But that's not what Peter is doing here. He's not challenging the believers as, what's the matter with you guys, as much as he is saying, hey guys, remember, if we use the football illustration, remember when you used to play Sandlot and you were a terrible player and I came and recruited you, and man, you didn't know the back side of a football to the front side. You didn't know what uprights were. Remember that? You put your pads on backwards. Remember how you used to be, and look what I trained you to be, and I got you a scholarship to college, and now you're playing college football. So guys, you've played a lousy game, but you're better than that. Let's go out and take this second half and play the way we always play. If you were the player and the coach came in and gave you a pep talk like that, man, it would stir up inside of you, come on, coach, we're going to get them. Right? Because it's calling you back to remembrance of what you were, to what you are now, and calling you to live different because of who you are. So just in simple illustration, that's really what Peter is doing here. He uses those repetitive statements in verse 9. He says, you're a chosen generation, royal priesthood, holy nation, peculiar people. We unpacked that a little bit this morning. But again, the idea, the calling of the chosen generation is that you're a unique grouping of people, a royal priesthood. You used to live outside of the camp. You've been called in to be God's priests before Him. And I find that really, truly amazing. Just this week, I was reading in my devotions in Leviticus the requirements for a priest. And you get this image in Leviticus like the priest, just like the sacrifice, needs to be without spot and blemish. He needs to be in a class all his own. And in the Old Testament, that was the goal, to reveal, like, this needs to be a special person. And the requirements of that, like, you can't have physical deformities. You need to be a good-looking guy. You can't be crook-backed or dwarf, which I don't actually know what all of that means, except to say that you can't be a little twisted-up person. You need to be someone who looks right. It's that one of the requirements is you can't marry a divorced woman. You can't marry a prostitute. You have to marry a virgin. And you look at all those requirements, and you consider that would have narrowed the community down to a select few. But because of Jesus Christ, now in the New Testament, no matter who you are, no matter how crooked you once were, no matter how deformed you once were, no matter what your past is in relationships or sexuality, God, because of Jesus Christ, fulfilled all of that, and now every one of us have the privilege and the calling. You are a kingdom of priests. It truly is remarkable. A priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. Now, why is it that he reminds us of all of that? And here is our very first application. Because of all of that, because of who you are, this is what your outworking ought to be. He says, that ye should show forth or declare the praises of Him who hath called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Suffice it to say, he's saying, because you are different, let it shout. Sing about it. Talk about it. May I ask you, is praise default for your lips? If we're all honest, complaining is often default for our reactions. And yet the man or the woman that begins to remember and to take in time to soak in what I was and what Christ has bought me and the privilege that I now have, praise is what ought to flow from us. Do the unbelievers around you know you to be a Johnny Raincloud, a Debbie Downer? Or do they know you to be someone who is like a ray of sunshine because praise is on their lips? I was listening to a podcast over the last week and a half or so about a large Southern Baptist church in Jacksonville, Florida, from that boomed back in the 70s and the 80s. They went from over 10,000 members to, in the early 2000s, they began a rapid decline. Financial debt was suffocating. People began to leave in droves, and a man came in that was asked to come in and take the church to try to revitalize it. And one of the issues of that church, they had thousands and thousands of square feet of property, and they were spending they were going into debt $270,000 a month just to pay payroll, and it was an unsustainable journey. And this pastor came in, and he said in the podcast, he said, I had to teach my people to love God and to love their neighbor, and in order to do that, I had to teach them to be thankful. And I thought that was very interesting. I would have said, yes, teach them to love God. Yes, teach them to love their neighbor. But he realized one of the most practical outworkings of being a genuine believer is that I'm thankful. And Peter here, he calls us to this. He says, because you're different, it ought to be foremost in your mind that you are declaring and testifying of the praise of Him. Of who? The one who rescued you from darkness. Has your salvation made such a difference in your heart and life that you've told someone about it? I think often if you've been saved for any length of time, our salvation gets more distant and distant, unless you're experiencing regular salvations. And I don't mean getting saved again in the justification sense, but I do mean experiencing Jesus being your sufficiency on a regular basis. I'm embarrassed to tell you how recent this next illustration is, but on Friday, so today's Sunday, 2 days ago, my wife and I had a difficulty. I don't know what to call it. I wouldn't call it an argument, because we didn't actually get into an argument. It was more like a silent argument where there wasn't much communication going on, and it was odd. I said something that she misunderstood, then she replied with something that I misunderstood, so I'm upset over something that she didn't mean, and she's upset over something that I never said. You ever had that happen? And it was like this turmoil began building all morning long. I was supposed to have a discipleship phone call at 9 o'clock that morning, and it's 8:45, and I'm supposed to give this guy a call in 15 minutes. I'm thinking the last thing I want to do is go have one of those phone calls, because I feel so awful right now. And I told Emma, I was like, I don't know, I can't figure out what's going on between us. She said, well, just go take a walk. And so that's what I did. I went for a walk and just praying, crying out to the Lord. And at one point during that day, and again, this is only 2 days ago. I feel bad it was so recent, but I'm a growing Christian, right? And at one point, I just sat down on the curb and I put my head in my hands, and I'm just talking to the Lord like, Lord, what am I missing here? And the God who gives light and darkness, in that moment, it's like God shined a light bulb and showed me an area of gross selfishness that had started the whole process. And what I had been doing was blaming Emma, and in fact, it was me that had started it all. And at that moment, it was like darkness turned to light. There was conviction, but not just conviction like condemnation. It was conviction with light, like, oh, Lord, it was me. And at that point, I was able to confess it, go back to the house and rectify with my wife. And I experienced just 2 days ago the God that moves from darkness to light. I've been saved for 25 years. But on Friday, I experienced another taste of the God who gives salvation. When you and I experience that, sometimes when a preacher says, hey, are you glad you're saved? We ought to talk about it. Sometimes we can think, well, that was 3 decades ago. But if you're experiencing regular tastes of the gospel at work in your life, that ought not be 3 decades ago. It ought to have been this week in some form or another. And so when you and I experience Christ's deliverance, think about what an unbeliever, if I gave that testimony to an unbeliever, man, I had a spat with my wife. Oh yeah, let me tell you, we do that all the time. Oh, he can resonate with that. But if I told him, man, I went for a walk and I was praying and Jesus showed me where I was selfish, and I went home and confessed that to my wife, what kind of a testimony is that to an unbeliever? He's never heard that before at the bar. Consider what that will do. Your testifying and praising of Christ's active salvation, what will that do for an unbeliever? Because you are different, praise is what Peter is saying here. God rescued you out of that, made you His peculiar people, that you would show forth the praises of Him. Not my praise. I have nothing to boast in, but the praise of what God has done. He has called us out of darkness into His marvelous light. May I just make one more application? Are you experiencing any darkness right now in your soul? Is there any area of darkness right now? Confusion, frustration, discord between another person or you and God, that you need Christ's manifest salvation, that you would be able to give testimony. Even in the middle of this service, I would encourage you in your heart to cry out to the Lord and say, Father, I need light in, and name the area. But continue on with me. In verse 10, Peter continues. which in time past, so he's reminding you, came out of darkness into light. Verse 10, which in time past were not a people. You as Gentiles, you were nothing, but now you are the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, I plead with you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. He says in verse 9, because you are different, you ought to praise. Verse 11 reveals, because you are different, you need to refuse sin. How confusing is it to the unbeliever to watch proclaimed believers live just like unbelievers? He is saying, friends, that ought not be. I beg of you, physically, you are different than everybody else because you're a stranger, you're a foreigner. It would be like someone from, say, South Africa or someone from Canada, someone coming down to this area. You can tell right away, you're not from around here, or probably my accent, you can see you're not from Texas. And he's saying, you're already different. It betrays you. So you need to say no to the flesh. Because you're different, refuse sin. You say, wow, that's a lot easier said than done, which is why when Christ left, he gave his followers the Spirit. And in Galatians chapter 5, the scripture says, this I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another. There's a call all throughout the New Testament. Because you have the Spirit in you, say no to the flesh. Is there a war of turmoil in your soul? Is it possible because you who are sanctified said yes to the flesh, said no to Christ, and internally right now there is a constant battle of shame, a constant battle of remorse, a constant battle. Have you ever noticed that when you and I commit sin and live in sin, one of the very first areas that the devil attacks is your identity? You call yourself a Christian. You call yourself a preacher. You call yourself an evangelist. You call yourself a Christian dad. You call yourself a deacon. You call yourself a pastor. He often first, his attacks will be against your identity, because what's happening is you are living contrary to your identity. So what is the solution? Returning back to, who am I in Christ? I am His, and He has said, if I confess my sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But again, I want to ask you, is there a war currently inside of your soul? The opposite of peace is war. Yielding to the flesh yields internal war. Nothing creates more inner turmoil and pain like following the passions of my own lusts. My experience with sin is twofold. Have you ever experienced someone's sin against you? You weren't looking for an altercation, and yet someone, because of selfishness, someone because of lack of sensitivity, someone because of their own pride, sinned against you. Do you feel the angst? Have you ever felt the pain that brings into your life when someone sins against you? But did you know that often when someone sins against us, we return sin against sin? We respond in sin to someone sinning against us. And what started out as turmoil that was inflicted upon us by my choosing to yield to the lusts of my pride and my flesh, I often enter into that same turmoil. Just recently, I was talking with a pastor. He was telling me the story. The Lord has allowed him to pastor a large church on the west side of Houston, when he was called in to take that church. It was a church with, it was a large church with a campus. And when they called him in and asked him to take the campus, he said, if I'm going to take the campus church, I don't believe we ought to do a campus church. He believed in the autonomy of the local church. And he said, if you're going to ask me to do this, we're going to cut this off. This is going to be its own church building. And they said, its own church body and our own autonomous church. And they said, okay, that's fine. And so he came on as the pastor, and then found out later that the host church had left them with more than $10 million in debt, had sold a large piece of property, and had not used any of the money to pay off the debt. And so now as he's coming in, he's saddled with this $10 million in debt. And he told me that has been one of the greatest challenges in my time pastoring, is not to get frustrated with them for how they treated us. And what he was giving assent to is, it's really easy when you have been wronged to turn around and blame, and what you have just done is you have done wrong. In the same way, an employee is mistreated. Maybe he's lied about by his employer. He is sinned against. But as soon as he, because of pride or is trying to save face, when he responds in complaining against his employer and gossiping about his employer and blasting his employer in social media, he has just entered back into the same exact war against the soul. A church member is overlooked, slighted, treated abrasively by another church member or a staff member. He becomes sinned against, and then that church member goes out and begins spreading discord and gossip, or gives the pastor or gives another member the silent treatment. And what have you done? You've just entered into the conflict. A parent that is sinned against by his adult child or spouse, then feeling he is attacked personally, responds in anger and pride, and he then takes that turmoil upon himself and enters into sin. And all these illustrations I've given, there's many that we could continue to give more, but what is Peter saying? Because you are different, because Christ lives in you, say no to the lusts, the passions of your flesh. I take great comfort in realizing that the example of Christ is that he loved with little return, allowing himself and his reputation to be abused and scarred and dragged through the mud. And he calls us, because our Father is a just judge, he calls us to live the exact same way, not returning evil for evil or railing for railing, but instead to live out our identity and live as Christ. Because we are different, God calls us to praise. Because we are different, he calls us to say no to the flesh. Again, as I conclude this point, is there war in your soul right now? Do not allow the wicked one to tear down your identity. Go back to your identity. I am in Christ, and he will forgive me. Robert Murray McShane said it this way: for every one look that I look at myself, I must take 10 looks at Christ. I believe that is the proper proportion. The devil would like you to take 1 look at Christ and 9 looks at yourself. And Christ says, return to me. Because you are different, praise. Because you are different, say no, abstain from fleshly lust. But then move down to verse 12. He continues on. This living out of our difference, our sanctification. Verse 12, he says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles. I think many of us understand this. This word conversation is not expressly dealing with our talk. That word conversation is dealing with the whole of how I live. It's talking about your lifestyle. Certainly that would include my conversation, how I speak, the words I use, but he's dealing with a larger whole, and he's saying, because you are different, it ought to affect your life. And what ought to affect your life? You ought to be marked by this word, honesty. Or could I put it this way? To use your theme, it ought to look like authenticity. Let me ask you, does your neighbor know you are a believer? You say, well, yeah, I told him. Good. But what if you hadn't? Would he still recognize you're different? You and I are called of God to preach the gospel, an audible declaration of the gospel. And any believer who rarely gives the gospel is a deformed believer, is a immature believer, is a dwarfed believer. But may I ask you, have you only spoken the gospel and failed to live out the gospel? The command here, the reason that Paul is writing this, continue on there in verse 12. Whereas they, meaning the pagans, speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. In Peter's day, the Christians were in an uphill battle. There was a natural disdain for those who called themselves Christ followers. Now, today I feel like, at least in American culture and Western culture, there may not be so much as a disdain as opposed to any other religion, as much as just an indifferent religion. And of course, it depends on what part of the country you're in, people's perspective on you. But if you were to move to a new neighborhood and nobody knew where you went to church, and nobody knew that you were a believer, how long would it take them, simply observing you in their neighborhood, how long would it take them to tell they're different? Back in the 90s, there was an explosion of a style of evangelism called lifestyle evangelism. There's many books written about it. And then several years later, there was many books written against it, because in many situations, the people who preached lifestyle evangelism, the way it was received or the way it was lived out was essentially, be good and don't say anything. And we recognize, and the reason that it was preached, lifestyle evangelism was preached against, was because that's not articulating the gospel. And Mark calls us, in the book of Mark, Jesus in Mark's gospel, calls us to preach the gospel. But because I believe that we realize, that's not right, there have been some that have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and have forgotten that the Scripture does call me. Your lifestyle better declare the gospel. If you are a believer, your lifestyle is like the soft rain that falls from heaven to soften the ground so that the seed can have any roots. It's a cliche to say, they don't care how much you know till they know how much you care, but the truth is, it's real, is it not? Have you proved to your coworker? Have you lived out to your neighbor that you care? The word Peter uses, he says, is your lifestyle and your good works. There ought to be something that is different about the way I live, that an unbeliever takes pause to step back and muse and wonder, why are you different? Because you are. He says, live honest. What does it mean to live honest? It means to live with integrity. In business today, there is many men that would climb the corporate ladder to financial success using any means possible, whether it be fraud, dishonesty, cheating, manipulation. And we all know that eventually that will crumble because it is a house of cards. But any businessman who builds on integrity, saved or unsaved, but any businessman and business who builds on integrity and transparency, even if it costs them, will always find that the general public flock to their business. I don't know who are the businessmen in this church, but most everyone in this church has a job. Are you known to be a man or a woman of integrity? Do you steal office supplies? Do you excuse it? Do you use the business credit card in ways that is not appropriate? If you make a mistake, do you take responsibility for it? I don't want to preach like, hey, everybody here ought to not mess up. No, you're going to mess up at some point. Do you live honest when you mess up? Do you go back to your employer and say, boss, I shouldn't have done that? Just recently, this is not a work illustration. This is another one of those, unfortunately, recent illustrations in my life. But In the last month or so, we were driving somewhere. I don't remember the details, but I just remember we were driving somewhere and my 3 children in the back were getting rambunctious. I think we'd been in the car for several hours and they were just getting a little bit out of hand. And I was working through something in my mind and it was just getting too loud. And I turned around and I reprimanded the 2 oldest because they were just not being sensitive to Daddy. And as I turned back around, I knew that I had lost my cool with them. I was unloving with them. And immediately the shame of, you blew it again as a dad, just began to press in on me. And I went in silence for several more miles. And as I'm talking with the Lord on the matter, I finally turned to Emma and I said, Emma, why do I fail in this area so much? And I turned to my children and I said, Gilbert, Ginger, Daddy's wrong. I should not have done that. And there's a certain grief in my heart because I want to be a better father. And I was talking to Emma later on that evening about that, and I don't want to, I need to grow in my patience and all of that. And then she said this. She said, but you still modeled Christianity for us. Because when you were wrong, you acknowledged it. And it was like a ray of sunshine as I began to realize God has not called me to never fail. He's called me to live honest. He's called me to need Him. So when you are in your business and you do make a mistake, own it. Take responsibility for it. Do you know that what that will model to unbelievers? This guy is different. There's a story that another evangelist has told, and I don't remember all the details, and it's a fairly common story, so some of you may have heard it before, but there was a well-known preacher. In fact, I believe it was Evangelist Ed Nelson, if you know that name. Ed Nelson, in his early years, was preaching at a factory in Georgia. He had been told that all the workers gather at their lunch break, and it's a 30-minute lunch break, and you can go and preach to them. And so Ed Nelson had gone to there for 5 days of that week. He preached every half-an-hour lunch break, and he preached the gospel to them. Near the end of that week, he didn't see much visible response, but near the end of that week, he was called into the office of management, and they said, you have no idea what that has done for our business. He said, we have had more people come back and return tools and nails and things that they pilfered from us. Your preaching is making a difference. What were the unbelievers in management saying? We're seeing who, at least who are convicted, but we're seeing who the Christians are. We're seeing it lived out. They're being honest again. May I challenge you? Live honest. In 1861, a young man by the name of John Wanamaker in Philadelphia had a dream and a vision of starting a department store, or I should say, starting a clothing store that would be different from everything else. Up to that point, he had worked for the YMCA. He was a well-known believer. But he believed that he could enter into merchandise, and if he lived out his Christian convictions, he could actually use his clothing store as a pulpit for Christ. In that day, in the 1860s, the way merchandise was sold was through haggling, purely through haggling and dickering. You would grab a coat off the rack and you would walk up to the cash register or to one of the salesmen and you would say, how much is this? The salesman would subtly size you up and determine how much they thought you were worth and how much they could pull out of you. And then they would give you a price based upon how much they assumed you had. And then you would start the process of dickering and haggling. It's how all purchases were made back then. And John Wanamaker believed that he could model integrity and transparency. So he came up with this idea called a price tag, where he placed on this small tag the amount that the coat cost as far as overhead, the markup, so that they all knew what he was earning, and then the set price, and there was no haggling. And he put these tags on all of the clothes in his store, and he was the laughingstock of all the businessmen in Philadelphia. They all believed him to be a fool, and he would be ruined within a matter of weeks. But can you imagine what happened? As people began to realize that these price tags actually put them on equal footing, they began to start going to his store. He then added on top of that something no one had ever heard of. He called it the money-back guarantee. If your product is not up to snuff, as it were, then you can bring it back for a full refund. People thought that was just marketing baloney, but when he actually stood by his promise, Philadelphia began flocking to his store. It made him a multi-millionaire. Today, you can still find his original Wanamaker store in Philadelphia. It's one of the most well-known Philadelphia attractions, all because he chose integrity. One commentator, this is a PBS article, wrote this: "The concept of truth in advertising earned him the public's trust, which he never lost." And he was a believer who believed that living honest could be a pulpit for Christ. It comes out of 1 Peter chapter 2. Having your lifestyle honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. That leads me to my final point. Because you are different, praise. Because you are different. Lost my spot. Thank you. Refuse sin. Because you are different, live honest. And because you are different, the lost will be affected. That last phrase in verse 12, in the day of visitation, what is that referring to? It's not referring to door-to-door evangelism or Thursday night visitation. That's not what it's referring to. I heard of a pastor that one time named his bass fishing boat the USS Visitation. So if anybody called him on Saturday morning, he could say, "I'm on visitation." That's a joke. I don't know if that actually happened, but that's not what this word visitation is referring to. In the day of visitation is likely referring to the final day of judgment when all believers stand and rejoice around the bema seat of Christ. And what Peter is saying is, if you in your lifestyle live out who you are as a Christian, someday at the judgment seat, there are going to be fellow believers standing around you who were won because of how you lived. Church family, it is not insignificant. I would challenge you, church family, to give the gospel. But could I also say, please do not give the gospel if you are not willing to live the gospel. It is hypocrisy. It stinks in the eyes of God, and it stinks in the eyes of unbelievers. But the man and the woman who lives out who they are draws and attracts. And when someone says, "Why are you different?" and then you can give them a reason of the hope which is in you with meekness and fear, then they can say, "They're different because of Christ, and that's what I want." My dad still lives in Maine, where I was born and raised. My dad is in the forestry business. My dad has been in ministry, currently is not in full-time ministry, but is constantly looking for any way that he can use his business as a billboard for Christ. Several years ago, he was driving one of his large, it was a kind of a stake bed truck. He put firewood in it, and he was driving his stake bed truck through an intersection. It was in the evening, it was winter time, so the daylight savings, it was getting dark, and he was driving this truck through an intersection, and the truck had been sitting for quite some time, so it was a little bit rough. And as he was accelerating through the intersection, his truck coughed and sputtered and died. And the traffic's backing up, and he's coasting through this intersection, and he's thinking, "Oh, no, this is not the right time." And so he throws it into neutral, and he's trying and hoping that he can get off to the side so he doesn't hold up the whole intersection. And his first immediate thought is, "Ugh! Why now? This is not good." And the Spirit of God immediately convicted him and said, "Now is the time to choose to rejoice." You ever had the Spirit of God do that and you're thinking, "This is not the time to rejoice"? And He's saying, "Yes, this is, because it's a trial, rejoice." And so at that moment, and my dad would tell you, he doesn't always take the opportunity, but that day he said, "Lord, I want to rejoice. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand it." He was able to get the dump truck off to the side, and as he's sitting there in the truck saying, "God, this all seems bad, but I'm going to give you thanks for what you're doing." A man who had been behind him driving along was a diesel mechanic and had seen the engine cough and sputter and pull to the side. And so the man driving behind him said to his driver, "Hey, pull up in front of that guy. I'm going to go see if I can help." My dad's sitting in the driver's seat of that truck saying, "Lord, I'm going to rejoice." And this diesel mechanic runs up and raps on the door, and my dad opens it, and he says, "Hey, what happened?" My dad said, I don't know, and jumps out with him, and they start talking and open up the hood and look at some things. And the diesel mechanic thought he knew what he could do to help him. And I can't remember the details of how they got the truck back to my dad's property. But long story short, the diesel mechanic, after the episode was all over, walked back to the vehicle, got inside the passenger side, turned to the man that was driving and said, "I don't know what that guy has, but whatever he has, I want it." Because he had helped my dad, they had exchanged numbers, and that guy, over the next couple of weeks, had helped him work on his truck, and that began a relationship that spread out over several years. And my dad began to give him the gospel. At first, he was resistant, and so my dad just kept loving on him. When other people wouldn't use him as a mechanic, my dad chose to still go back, not because he was the greatest mechanic, because he wanted to show love to him. Eventually, the man agreed to do a 4-week Bible study called The Exchange. I don't know if you're familiar with that evangelistic Bible study, but my dad began doing that Bible study with this man. His name was Dana. And on the 4th week, I remember it specifically because all of us kids were upstairs in our dining room praying as my dad and Dana were in the basement of our house. They were doing the Bible study, and that evening, Dana trusted Christ. That was a several-year span of my dad, first of all, living out Christ, and someone said, "It's different." And then as my dad began to continue to show this man love, he was presented with the opportunity and then drove home with the gospel, because that is what God calls us to. But his life set up for the message. And even after he got saved, this man Dana was regularly going to a psychiatrist for some kind of counseling. And several weeks after he got saved, the psychiatrist called him and says, "You've not been in on one of your appointments." He says, "It's because I don't need you anymore." What am I saying? There's so many illustrations we can use. I'm saying, church family, what the Scripture is saying is that the unbelievers are watching. And God calls us because you're different. Not because you're special by something you've done. You're special because something I've done. So because you're different, live different. Have the confidence. I'm a child of the King. I don't have to wow you. I don't have to wear my $1,000 power suit to make you think I'm impressive. Ladies, you don't have to live and present yourself seductively to make men be attracted to you. Christ in you is what makes you different. And when you and I live boldly, loving God and loving others, people notice. God calls us to praise because we are different. God calls us to say no to sin because we are different. Because we are different, He calls us to live honest. And because we are different, souls we brought into the kingdom because they've seen us living out the gospel. May I call to you, church family, to join me in asking God to teach us how to live different. Could you bow your heads with me and close your eyes here this evening? I don't think we could take too much time to realize and remember and just soak in how God has made me uniquely His own. This week, would you look at the lost different? Would you give them a smile? Would you turn the other cheek? Would you pray for them? Would you love them sincerely? Would you give praise to the fact that God called you out of darkness into light? If God has dealt with you this evening, maybe about an area that, again, you've lived ashamed, maybe about an area where there is war inside of your soul because of some flesh indulgence. Maybe right now your identity is at stake in your mind because because of a sin decision, the devil's been just attacking you, and you need to take back your identity. Maybe there's been an area of dishonesty in how you live your life. If God has dealt with you, would you come before Him and receive His full forgiveness? And would you call on Him to show you how to love and live different? Could we stand together with heads bowed and eyes closed? This is an opportunity to live. The piano is going to play. Would you come to the altar, sit back down in your pew? But if God has dealt with you, would you simply humble yourself before Him and acknowledge Him as the piano